Check out FlipsideGaming.com for all your gaming needs. Use the promo code HEROES to save 10% on all orders over $10 and support the channel at the same time. Hey there, this is John from Heroes and Legends, and welcome to part 1 of our 6-part Ixalan Full Set review. Today we're going to look at all of the white cards in the set, and of course as we go through the week we will be examining all the cards color by color through the color pie. Now, in case you haven't seen this series before for other sets, I just want to give you a quick idea of what to expect here. We're going to look at every card individually. First and foremost, we're going to analyze the card through the lens of limited. So we're going to be talking about sealed, we're going to be talking about draft. Now, after that, if any card is going to be possibly playable in standard or modern or any other format, we will discuss that. There's also some cards in here that could be good commander cards. I will definitely notate that, although keep in mind I won't mention that for every card because tribal commander, a lot of these cards are going to be very playable. Now, with that being said, quickly before we get started, if you check out the description below, you find a couple ways to help support the channel. It's always really appreciated. You'll find our Patreon page down there. You'll find some product links for things on Amazon. If you make any purchases there, we get a small percentage. And then finally, Flipside Gaming is also doing some pre-orders right now for Ixalan as well as Iconic Masters, and they have given our viewers a promo code to save some money, which is really awesome of them. So with that being said, let's get into these cards. And we'll begin with the Donto Vanguard. We're starting off with a really good card, actually. I love cards that allow me to take my life total and use it as a resource. This card is one of those cards that does it. This is a super aggressive card. It costs 2 to cast, of course, comes in as a 1/1, but it attacks as a 3/1. That's very important if you're trying to be aggressive. And that pay life to make it indestructible is really sweet because it creates a situation that's very difficult for your opponent. Imagine playing this, say you're on the play and you play this on turn 2. And then on turn 3, you're going to attack in with a 3/1. Maybe your opponent has a 2/2 in play. They have a tough decision to make. Do they just simply block with their 2/2 and then see if you trade, or take the 4 mana to keep your card alive, and they lose their 2/2 and start losing board state, and they're going to have to start coming back from that already. That's a tough call to make, right? And it's going to depend on what's in their hand and potentially what's in your hand, if that's a good call or not, to block. So just generally, this card makes life very difficult for your opponent. Now, what's nice is vampires have a life gain sub-theme. So even though you are spending life, you can recoup this life as the game goes on. But even if you don't have a lot of that in your deck for some reason, maybe you're just playing a dinosaur deck and you happen to have this card in it, I still think it's a very good card. I'm usually very happy to trade my life for resources, considering it's my option. There's going to be times where I'm not going to do it because it doesn't benefit me, but there's going to be many times where I will do it because it will benefit me. And like I said, it makes a tough decision for my opponent. I think this card is actually good enough to maybe even see some standard play in an aggressive build. And there's a few cards that I see in this set that make me feel like we may go from seeing some mono red and Rakdos color aggressive decks in standard to maybe some Boros. So keep an eye on this one. This is one you'll want to watch for the future, I think. Ashes of the Abhorrent. This is a sideboard card, basically. Yes, it does have some life gain attached to it, but I just think there's more efficient ways to gain life, and I'm not too worried about playing this just for life gain if I'm in a draft or sealed, because I think there's just better options. This is something I might sideboard in, though, if my opponent does have a card that they can interact with from the graveyard. There's a really good red one we're going to look at later in the week that does constitute. So if they have a card like that, yeah, I might board it in. And I think the same is true for standard. Now, this is one of those cards that they do put in a set just purposely. This is a very normal tactic to try to close off some of the strategies from the previous block so that the new block can flourish. Some of the strategies, of course, from Amonkhet included things like Aftermath, Embalm, Eternalize. This kind of hoses a lot of that. So what you're going to be able to do is, again, maybe have this as a sideboard card in standard if it's necessary. Just depends on where the meta goes, and if it is something that you're concerned about, then wonderful, you have this stashed in your sideboard. If not, then maybe it doesn't make it. I don't really see it crossing over well into Modern or Legacy or anything like that because they have Rest in Peace. Rest in Peace, I think, is still a more efficient card. Axis of Mortality. Now, this is our first mythic of the day, and I am going to jump right to Commander on this one. This feels like a very good Commander card. Maybe not a card I want to play most likely in other formats. I'll talk more about Limited in a minute, but I will say this. I'd be happy to throw this in a Pillow Fort deck, and it feels like it could do some sweet stuff. So a couple ways you can think of this card. First off, you could have some cards that maybe let you exchange life for resources, like card draw, and then you get your life total down, you switch it with someone, and you could rinse, wash, and repeat and do that every one of your upkeeps if you wanted to, and eventually hit everyone at the table. Now, you'd have to be able to protect yourself, protect this card. It is a little risky, but if the elements were in place, it could be a fun strategy. The other thing you could do with this card is play it as a political card and switch other people's life totals around, because it's target players. So that's actually kind of sweet. So could be a lot of fun and just something to just mess around with and try to build some alliances or something like that. Now, as far as limited goes, I don't see myself playing this very often. I feel like maybe I board it in against a hyper-aggressive build, and that way I can treat it like a life gain spell later in the game after I took a lot of damage, maybe in turn 2, turn 3, something along those lines. But I could also just play a 6-drop creature at that point, put pressure on my opponent, and also be able to defend myself. So I don't know if it's really worth it. It just feels a little too situational. And then aside from that, granted, there are some vampire cards that are allowing you to use your life for resource, but I do think it's a little situational, a little awkward to try to use this as a payoff of those cards. I'd rather just play some other cards that are going to let me gain life, quite honestly, I think. And because of all those reasons, I don't really see it crossing over into standard either. Bellowing Aegisaur. This card is actually quite elegant. I like the design of it, and here's what's cool for Ixalan. White cards in Ixalan basically care about two things: vampires and dinosaurs. This card crosses over well between the two different strategies. It's a big old dinosaur, maybe more of a defensive dinosaur with a big toughness, which I'll talk more about in just a second. But this is a card I might actually rather have in vampire decks, because vampire decks are trying to go wide. And yes, a couple extra +1/+1 counters on some dinosaurs with trample would be sweet, but having it on maybe 5 or 6 1/1 lifelink vampires would be even sweeter. So I think this card is going to have some competition when it comes to draft between those two different archetypes. So for vampires, it's great for that reason. For dinosaurs, it gets interesting because there is a multicolor card we're going to look at later in the week that does allow your creatures to deal damage based on toughness. So you will see a few creatures with larger toughness in this color, and it kind of makes sense just generally as a sub-theme for dinosaurs here and there, a very light sub-theme. Now, it's a small thing, but I do want to call that out because sometimes this card is going to be a little bit better if it's worked in conjunction with that card. But aside from that, this is still a good card for you just in either of the builds. A little too expensive for standard, and that's fine. I think it's a nice pickup for either of those strategies in limited. Bishop of Rebirth. Great card for sealed and for draft. Could be first pickable in draft, actually. And the ability to play this, it's a 3/4 vigilance for 5, nothing too overwhelming there. But when it attacks, and does have vigilance, so you can still defend with it, which is nice, the ability to take a 3 or less casting cost creature from your graveyard, put it right into play, is pretty awesome. Not always going to pay off, obviously, but a lot of the times it will. It's going to be really hard to deal with. Your opponent is going to have to get rid of this card before they can start dealing with the rest of your army. I like it a whole lot. There is a little bit of awkwardness due to the fact that sometimes the vampires are focused a little bit on tokens, and of course it doesn't work with tokens, but it doesn't matter. You're still going to have plenty of targets for this, especially if you're able to draft a deck with a lot of low curve things. You'll be really excited to play this card. I don't really see it crossing over into standard. I'd be curious to try it out, though. Again, an aggressive build is a higher end of the curve, but I don't really think it'd be worth it. I think there's better things you could be doing in the format, but I would at least entertain the thought. Bishop Soldier. 2-drop, lifelink, 2/2, great bear with upside for limited purposes, sealed or draft, and you don't even have to be in a vampire deck for this to be good for you. Granted, if you are in the vampire deck, maybe you have some cards where the lifelink will matter and you're going to be able to turn that life into a resource via some other cards, but even if that's not the case, still a great pickup. I've said this many times, but the 2 spot in your curve for sealed and draft, the most important spot in your deck, and it keeps you from falling behind. It keeps you relevant in the early portion of the game, and that's hyper critical. And imagine you're up against some sort of hyper aggressive start from your opponent. They come in with a 2/2 and a 2/1, you're on the draw. If you can play this and they're attacking in, well, wonderful. You can trade, prevent those 2 points of damage, and then gain 2 more life, negating the other 2 points of damage. It just keeps you afloat and keeps your early game a little bit smoother as you work into your mid-game to late-game plan. So this is a phenomenal card for those purposes. Bright Reprisal. Limited removal for white. Not necessarily great removal. If you can play other removal, I would recommend it, but if you need this, it's there for you. It only works on target attacking creature. A little bit awkward considering it costs 5. It does replace itself, though. I will give it that. That's actually really sweet. But it feels like a lot of times these cards will at least hit target attacking and blocking, or blocking creature. So having it just hit attacking creature does feel super narrow for that casting cost. Again, if you need the removal, you're going to run it and you're going to be okay with it. But if you can avoid this and find other removal, I would try to do so. Demystify, this one's a reprint, classic sideboard card. You pick this up late in a pack, maybe even at the end of a pack. You have it if you need it. There's some good enchantments actually in this set that we'll be looking at throughout the week, so it's going to be nice to have in your sideboard just in case you need it. Duskborn Sky Marcher. This is a one-drop flyer. You're going to see a lot of one-drops in this set, I'm going to warn you right now. And this particular one's also vampire, so that can be very relevant. It can also mess up some combat math between your other attacking vampires. I always like cards with that. It makes blocking much more thoughtful of a process for your opponent, which can be good for you. Now, I will say this, though. That particular ability does feel a little narrow because it still costs a white and you have to tap it. I feel like that's asking a lot. And just playing this because it's a 1/1 flyer isn't good enough. You want to have a benefit that's going to matter, or else you're just going to play either another 1-drop, because there's actually some really good ones we're going to see today, or you're going to play a 2-drop that's better. So a lot of times I don't think this makes my cut. If I'm all in on vampires, maybe I do run this one, but I don't know. A lot of times I feel like this sits in my sideboard. I do want to mention too, when it comes to constructive purposes, there are a lot of people thinking about small flyers as a deck, and you could maybe strategize a little bit with that even in sealed, because there is Favorable Winds, which is in blue. It's a reprint, which we'll talk about more tomorrow. That exists out there as an uncommon. So there is a lot of flying synergy between blue and white, which is kind of a typical Azorius thing, and it crosses over somewhat between vampires, dinosaurs, and pirates, which is odd. But you could draft that. And if you were lucky enough to maybe early on pick up a couple Favorable Winds, and all of a sudden any flying creature is going to be good. So do think about those things when you go through your draft. It's not always about the power level of the card individually, but what you already have and what could be around it. So this is a real good example of that, I think. And it kind of makes you think outside the box a little bit. Now, for constructive purposes, I don't know if a small flyers deck will get there. I guess we'll kind of see what happens with the meta, but it does feel like at least a fun thing to try to brew. Emissary of Sunrise. This is a great uncommon. I'm really high on this one. First off, for limited purposes, a 2/1 with first strike for 3, I'd play that. But this has Explore, and I will mention Explore is something you're going to see peppered throughout the entire set. A couple cards in white we'll look at today. This is one of them. Some of the time, this comes into play as a 3/2. 3/2 for striker for 3, that's phenomenal. Can't count on that, but even if it doesn't, you still got to explore, and there's value behind that as well. So for what you're paying here, I'm really excited about this card. This could be first pickable even in some packs for me. Another really good aggressive white card, and another reason I kind of say, I wonder if in Standard we could see a Boros aggro deck of some kind at some point. Encampment Keeper. This is another 1-drop, and this one's interesting. You'll see a number of these as we go through the set this week. It's a cheap 1/1, of course. This one has first strike, but it has an ability that's kind of expensive attached to it. Costs a white and 7. You do have to tap and sacrifice, unfortunately, so it's a little slow. But if you can pull it off, creatures you control get +2/+2 until end of turn. Now, who wants that? You guessed it, the vampires do, because they're going to go wide. It's fine for other builds as well, don't get me wrong, but this is going to be especially good with a bunch of 1/1 lifelink vampire tokens. Now, you have to be pretty confident that you can get there for 8 mana, and I think for the most part, you can. I'm not going to fill my deck with these, but running one of these in my deck feels fine. I don't even think I'm necessarily wanting to play this on turn 1 or turn 2 unless I'm really desperate for a play. I might just hang on to this until later in the game so it doesn't get destroyed prior to me being able to use it. But what's a little strange about that is you still have to tap it. So you still have to untap with this thing. It doesn't have haste or anything. So that's a little awkward. I kind of wish you could play it late as a surprise. Can't really do that with this card, but it's still runnable, maybe as a 1-of in the right build. Glorifier of Dusk. Well, here's something else to do with all that extra life you're going to gain. And this one's a little bit odd because it's a 4/4 for 5. If you pay 2 life, it gets flying till end of turn. And if you pay 2 life, it gets vigilance till end of turn. So it's basically a Sarah Angel if you pay 4 life every turn. So that feels kind of awkward. And because of that, I don't see it crossing over into Standard or anything. But I would run this in Limited and actually be pretty happy with it. Just the fact that I could pay 2 life to make it fly, a lot of times that's more than relevant. And if I need to do the vigilance thing, I can too. So I like the options it gives you for 5 mana and the possible evasion. I'm actually pretty happy with this one. Goring Ceratops. Okay, this is a dinosaur that is a great payoff card for your other dinosaurs in Limited. It is higher on the curve, of course. Dinosaurs hopefully will have a little bit of ramp behind them, though, especially from green. So if that's the case, this card gets a little bit better. It's a 3/3 double striker on its own, but it gives all your other attacking creatures double strike. Again, this isn't bad with vampires either, because again, going wide with those vampires and attacking in and just trying to do one huge strike, this is another card that kind of supports that strategy, which is kind of sweet. I like the crossover appeal of a card like this. It's a little more expensive, top of the curve. I will say in the dinosaur deck, it's going to be competing with other expensive stuff, so it maybe doesn't always get there. But I think a lot of the time you'll be happy to play it, and it could be a good payoff card for you in the late game. I will warn you, though, don't overdo the top of the curve on the dinosaur deck, even if you have some ramp to back it up, because you don't want to get flooded with those cards early in the game and have no plays, right? So you have to be really selective when it comes to your higher curve dinosaurs, because there's a lot of good ones out there. You don't want to overdo it, in other words. As for standard, I don't really see it showing up in the dinosaur deck. I do think we will see an Eye dinosaur deck, but this one is a little too dependent on the board state, and I think there's other things you could be doing at the higher spot of the curve that are more consistent. So regardless, though, it's still very good and limited. Imperial Aerosaur, a fine curve filler. It's also a flyer if you just need the evasion in limited. Maybe not a first or second pick, but I think it's a fine pickup in draft. We've seen cards like this before. Sometimes they're in blue. In this case, it's white, and they can do some work for you. Imperial Lancer. Here's another 1-drop. This one I'm not crazy about, though. Like, here's my problem with it. A 1/1 for 1. And if I get a dinosaur, now it gets double strike. Okay. Now I got a 1/1 double striker. It's not doing a whole lot. And if I buff it, okay, maybe I can attack in, but that's assuming my opponent can't block it. I don't know. It just feels like not enough. Even for 1 mana, that's saying something. I'd rather just play another one of the 1-drops that's better, or a 2-drop that's better than this most of the time. I don't really see this probably ever making my cut, quite honestly. Inspiring Cleric. This one gives you life when it enters the battlefield, so that's kind of sweet for what vampires are trying to do, but I don't necessarily feel like we need that all the time. I feel like the lifelink is maybe the more consistent way to go with that. But this is okay, considering it also is a 3/2 body for 3. I'd actually be happy to use this as a curve filler in any deck in limited, but the extra gain life also just makes it a little bit better. So yeah, it's a fine pickup. Again, not like first, second, third pick in a pack necessarily, but a good higher to middle portion of the pack pick, especially if you're in vampires. Ixalan's Binding. Alright, this is fantastic removal for limited purposes. First pickable in a lot of packs in draft. And that second ability isn't always going to come into play, I will say that. But the first ability, being the Oblivion Ring ability, is great. It's a non-land permanent, deals with a lot of various threats. And for 4 mana, it's alright. I mean, I'd rather pay 3 for an Oblivion Ring, but I'll pay 4 and probably be almost as happy with it in limited. Now, as far as standard goes, I don't see this taking over for cast out. I think that's just a better card with the flash and the cycling. But who knows, maybe at some point, if there was some card that is doing a lot of damage in multiples, maybe this becomes a sideboard option in lieu of cast out sometimes. But I think for the most part, cast out's going to own the constructed formats. Kajal Collar. This is another 1-drop. This one's quite good. 0/3 for 1, and your dinosaurs cost 1 less to cast. This is perfect for dinosaur strategies for a couple of reasons. One, it's ramp. Of course you want to ramp into these big old dinosaurs. Secondly, though, it's a way to defend yourself in the early portion of the game where the dinosaurs could be bottlenecked a little bit. It might take a few turns to get them out, get the ramp going, and sometimes you get some awkward draws where you can't get to your ramp fast enough and you're going a little slower than you'd like. Well, this helps keep off those smaller creatures in the meantime. Great card, just 1 mana if you're playing dinosaurs. You don't even have to be playing a lot of dinosaurs. Even if you're playing a few dinosaurs like in a sealed deck, it's still a good choice. Great 1-drop. And again, standard, I think we will see this in an Eye Dinosaur build. Kajal E Sunwing. Alright, this is another good draft pick, like a first pickable card probably in a lot of packs. Nice little evasion creature, 2/3 with flying, but maybe more importantly, for 3 mana, on top of that, you're getting creatures your opponents control enter the battlefield tapped, slowing down your opponent. That can be a big deal, especially if they have an aggressive build, or if you have an aggressive build and you're worried about racing. And this is another card that makes me think about maybe some Boros aggro, because again, aggro decks really want to push across damage as quickly as possible. This helps that deck do that. It helps them get that damage across like 1 more turn, just 1 more time. Sometimes that's enough. So watch for that in standard as maybe a possibility down the road at some point. But aside from that, though, great limited card. Legion Conquistador. This is an interesting one. This card, a little bit reminiscent, of course, of Squadron Hawk. Different, though, at the same time, being a 2/2 for 3 and doesn't have flying or anything. Now, one thing to keep in mind, Squadron Hawk looked amazing in Standard back in its day, but it also was surrounded by some amazing equipment, Stoneforge Mystic, and a little card called Jace the Mind Sculptor. So I think just about any card would have looked amazing in that deck. But yeah, Squadron Hawk definitely had a role there. The question is, will this have a role? It's a good concept, and I know I'm kind of talking about constructed first on this one, but I'm not really sure where it fits, because I don't really see a vampire deck crossing over into constructed standard. I mean, I could be wrong, but I don't know if all the pieces are there, at least quite yet. So I'm not really sure where you want to play this card. I'm not going to count it out. I do think it does have, at least raw power-wise, the potential to maybe see standard play at some point before it leaves the format, but I'm just trying to wrap my head around the strategy that you want to use this card for. Now, for limited purposes, this is a really bad card if you just have one. It's not a great card if you have two, but it's playable if you're strapped. 3, it's a good card. I'd be happy to play it. 4, it's a great card. 5, it's awesome. So the more copies you can pick up, say in a draft, the more this card becomes playable and becomes better and better and better the more you get. So the goal here is keep drafting them. They're at common. Hopefully you'll get a few of them. Now, other people might get that same idea, so it could be a little bit awkward at times, but if you can pull it off, it will be very good for you. And that's really how you want to think about this card. Not as good in sealed because, again, you probably only get 1 or 2. You could play 2 if you're just really desperate, but I really don't want to play this card till I get up to 3 most of the time. Legion's Judgment. In some ways, this is a little better than the other removal card we saw. Now, it's sorcery speed, but it only costs 3 at least, and it does destroy creature of power 4 or greater, so it gets rid of dinosaurs or some other big threats. I'd be happy to run at least one of these in my limited build. Be happy with it. Alright, our first transform card, we're going to have Legion's Landing, which turns into a Donto, the first fort. Basically, this is the card you want to play if you're all in on Vampires Go Wide. If you're all in on that deck, this card's going to be great for you. Comes into play, gives you a 1/1 white vampire, creature token with lifelink, and then eventually, hopefully you can attack in with enough creatures to transform it, and then it becomes kind of a 1 turn at a time mana sink to create more of these vampires, and it starts to slowly let you take over the game in conjunction with other cards that are helping you go wide and attack in with some buffs. That's the plan. I'm not first picking it, though, because I don't want to try to build around this card most of the time. I'm probably going to wait until I'm already in Vampires and then hopefully open this in pack 3 and be like, sure, I'll take it. It's a good card for that build, but it is a little narrow. It's not as good in every deck build, right? So if you have a deck that's conducive to this, you're going to run it. You'll be real happy with it. And again, I don't necessarily see this crossing over into Standard. I'm just not sold yet that the Vampires have enough pieces to get there, at least at this point. Maybe that will change with the next set. Looming Altis. This one is high toughness, 1/7 for 4. Sometimes, I mentioned this earlier, you can't get your ramp going. You can't get those big dinosaurs out fast enough. Well, this is a good way to prolong the game and help you get there. It's a real nice blocker. It's going to deal with some big threats on the board. Now, the other thing I mentioned earlier as well, there is that card that does allow your creatures to do damage based on their toughness. Sometimes that could be relevant with a card like this too. That becomes much better if that card was in play. But aside from that, you sometimes play this card, especially if you're trying to go a little greedy with a higher end mana curve. But a lot of times you might skip this one too. Mavrin Fiend Dusk Apostle. I always want to say Marvin when this card comes up. It like trips me up for a second. But aside from that, much like the Transform card we just looked at, same rules apply here. I mean, this card is good in those Vampire Go Wide decks. I'd be happy to pick it up. Not going to first pick it because I'd rather already be in that deck before I grab this card. You could get a deal on it later in a pack, though, if you're the only one at the table that's in that strategy. And it's going to be pretty good there. If I'm not in that strategy, I'm probably going to pass it up. It's another card that I don't think really has the legs to make it into Standard, at least with what's surrounding it right now, but just generally another card that's good for that archetype. Paladin of the Bloodstained. This is another good curve filler that's also going to help you bolster out your vampires. So it gives you a vampire when it enters the battlefield, and it's a 3/2. So look at it this way. You're getting a 4/3 power toughness for 4. That actually feels relatively economical for limited purposes, which means, you know what, I'd be happy to play this even if I wasn't all in on the vampire strategy. If I'm playing sealed or something, it's still just a good white creature for the 4 spot if I'm looking for one. Pious Interdiction. This is a pacify effect. I love pacify effects in limited, so I'll be happy to play this. I'm paying a little more for it because of the potential gain life here, which is good with vampires, and subsequently it's also good with dinosaurs because you could take some early damage while you're working towards your big plays. So it kind of makes sense with what White's trying to do here, but at the end of the day, I'm just happy to play this because it's a pacify effect. Priest of the Awakening Sun, another 1-drop. This one is a dinosaur tutor, though. And I think this is good in your deck if you have a dinosaur that's important enough to tutor for. And that could be 1 or 2 dinosaurs, but if you want to make sure you hit those particular dinosaurs in your limited build, then this will be a fine card for you. I'm probably not first picking this. I'm going to wait until I already have the dinosaurs and I want to make my deck more consistent. What's nice about that, again, is sometimes ramp decks, you'll tend to all of a sudden draw all your ramp and you're not drawing your threats. This is another way to hopefully make sure you hit the right threat at the right time. So I think it could be good in a lot of dinosaur builds for limited games generally. I wouldn't play this on turn 1 and just leave it out there to die. And I'm not too concerned about the life gain. If I get it, wonderful. If I don't, I don't. But this is more of a card I play when I'm ready to search. So I play this and hopefully it survives. I can pay the 5, sacrifice it, and just go for my dinosaur. That's what I want to do with this card. This isn't about an early drop aggro card or anything like that. Now, with that being said, I do think there will be a dinosaur deck in Standard. I don't know if this is going to be a part of it, though. I think those decks will be able to build something a little more consistent that it won't necessarily need this. I think tutoring for basically 6 is just too expensive. There are actually tutors already in Standard that cost 5 to tutor for anything, and actually those aren't good enough to make it at this point, so I don't really see this getting there in Standard, but again, it does have its role for some limited builds. Pterodon Knight. This is a nice little 4-drop curve filler for limited, 3/3. Sometimes it has flying, just have to control a dinosaur. So if I have the dinosaur deck, and even if I just have a few dinosaurs, if some part of the time this is going to be a 4/4 flyer for 4, then yeah, it's pretty good. And if it's a 3/3 for 4, it's still on curve. Queen's Commission. Here's another way to get some of those vampire tokens, and if you're all in on that strategy, you'll be happy to run this. This is a common. You might be able to grab a couple of these and just help bolster out that board state. That particular deck will be happy if you have it, and other than that, this is one you might skip if you're not in that strategy. Railing Roar. Okay, now we're talking about payoffs for some of these vampire decks, and this is a good one. Could you play this in the dinosaur deck? Yeah, you could, and it'll be just fine, especially if you have to be a little more defensive for some reason. It's still a fine combat trick, but this is going to be especially good in those go wide vampire decks. And like I said, it's a combat trick for any aggressive deck, though. So if you're in sealed and you just have a mishmash of different creatures and you're running 3 colors or something, as long as you have enough creatures, it's still a good card to play. Raptor Companion. This is a 2 casting cost 3/1 dinosaur, and we're seeing a lot of these 2-drop 3/1s recently in Magic. This one also being a dinosaur, which could matter a lot of the time too. And I think people have different opinions on these 3/1s. I happen to like them quite a bit. I've had a lot of success with them just generally. A lot of the time, they just trade up, and I'm okay with that. If they're taking out a 3-drop or a 4-drop at times, that's pretty good. I feel like I got my money's worth for that. And every once in a while, your opponent stumbles and you're able to get in for maybe like 6 damage. That's actually really good for 2 mana. So I'm happy to run some of these. I have no issue with that. Ritual of Rejuvenation. This is just a gain life card. I'm not a big fan of cards that just simply gain you life, and I've said this in other videos, but my problem with that generally is you're buying yourself maybe another turn if you're lucky, but you're not advancing the board state, you're not doing anything to truly save yourself. This card might be a little better than some in the past for a couple of reasons, one of which you can do stuff with your life with some of these vampire cards. We've already seen that. Secondly, it replaces itself. That's actually kind of nice too. You're just paying the 3 mana, but at least you're not losing a card technically for doing this. I don't love it, but it's better than a lot of other things we've seen prior. Now, with that being said, I'm probably not playing this unless I'm really like all in on a number of cards that are taking from my life total. Then I might consider it. But for the most part, I don't think I'm going to use this one 99% of the time. Sanguines Sacrament. Okay, here's another instant speed life spell. This one I like a little more because this could actually be a very high amount of life in certain circumstances, right? Because this is twice the amount of mana that you pour into it with only 2 to activate. Now, again, not a big fan of life gain spells, but when you start talking significant life gain, I start to pay attention. And because of that, I think I could see myself running this at least a lot more often than that previous card. And if I have something to do with the life, great. or maybe I'm up against a hyper-aggressive deck, and if I'm not main decking it, then I could simply board it in. And same true with the last card. If you're up against a hyper-aggressive deck, board it in. It's going to help you a little bit. But regardless, this one I like a little bit better. It also goes back to the library, so you could, in theory, if you shuffle or something, get it back again. So it's kind of interesting. But this one I'm a little more apt to run, although it's probably not a high pick for me in a pack. Settle the Wreckage. This is interesting. It's a cross between Wrath of God and Path to Exile. When I first saw this card when it was previewed, I think I evaluated it more like a removal spell, like a mass removal spell. And I kind of thought to myself, well, is this better than like Hour of Devastation or even Bantu's Last Reckoning? What I wasn't thinking about at the time is, would I just play a Path to Exile for 4 in today's Standard? Yeah, I probably would. And if I hit more stuff with it, then I hit more stuff with it. And yeah, there's going to be times where the drawback is going to be awkward, or the fact that the creatures have to be attacking is going to be awkward. But if you think of this as a forecasting cost path that sometimes has more upside, yeah, it's Standard playable. This will see play in Standard, I have no doubt. As far as Limited goes, it's a good card. First pickable in Draft. You'll be happy to run this in Sealed. It's just a real good removal spell, even if it's not a board wipe. Don't necessarily think of this as a one-sided board wipe. Just think of it as a removal spell. Sometimes you'll be pleasantly surprised. Sheltering Lights. Okay, combat trick. Not a lot for me to say about this one. It's a cheap combat trick that lets you scry too, so I do like that. These won't always make your cut. If you need one, maybe you're short removal or something like that, then maybe it's a 23rd playable for you. Shining Aerosaur. Okay, this is a 5-drop 3/4 flyer, but it is a dinosaur, so I'm going to run this under probably 2 situations. I'm desperate for a dinosaur because I'm in that build, or I'm desperate for a flyer because I need some evasion. Either way, it's an okay card. It's nothing super exciting, but it's there if you need it. Skyblade of the Legion, great 2-drop, 1/3 flyer. It's also a vampire, but you don't need to be in a vampire deck for this to be good for you. It's going to deal with a lot of hyper-aggressive early creatures, even a small flyer. Plays well with some of the other flyers if you go all in on like the Azorius Flyers plan, but just generally it's a good card no matter what, as long as you're in white. Slash of Talons. This one is another removal spell, this time for smaller creatures. Now, we've seen a lot of these type of cards in red. This is a little more narrow, though, being white, because it can only work on attacking or blocking creatures, but you know what? It's worth running one in a deck. Sometimes it will come in handy. Steadfast Armas. This one's an okay curve filler. Like, it's not super exciting. 2/3 Vigilance for 4, not really exciting for me. It is a dinosaur if you are in the market for one, though. And yes, it does have that ability. If you pay into it and tap, you can have it do damage to a blocking or blocked creature based on its toughness. So they're trying to bring that little tiny sub-theme in. But I don't know, it just doesn't really work for me. So yeah, if I need it, it's there. But a lot of times I'm going to skip this one. Sunrise Seeker. The only thing that's awkward about this card is it's a human scout. It's not a vampire, it's not a dinosaur, but you know what? It explores, so I don't care. It's a 5 casting cost, sometimes 4/4 vigilance, but even if it's a 3/3, I still got to explore, and I do think there's a lot of value behind that. It's a common, nice curve filler, but I'd be happy to run one of these. Territorial Hammerskull. This one costs 3 for a 2/3 dinosaur, and when it attacks, tap target creature an opponent controls? Yeah, sign me up. This is phenomenal. We've seen a lot of red cards like this in the past. They're always good in limited, and this is great crossover appeal between a number of different decks, basically. The dinosaur deck will like this because it allows for one of those big dinosaurs to get cross more damage. The vampire deck will like this because they're trying to do a big strike with maybe a combat trick attached to it or something like that. That extra damage can put away a game. These are phenomenal, and they're a common. You could get a couple of these in your pool. That would be super sweet. This card's fantastic, and again, another card that makes me think, standard Boros aggro, maybe? Takali Honor Guard. It's a fine 2-drop if you need a 2-drop. I will say that. It's a 1/3 for 2. Sometimes that's necessary. But keep in mind, creatures entering the battlefield don't cause abilities to trigger. So that goes for your stuff as well. So that could put you back if you have some good enters the battlefield effects on creatures you care about. Now, with that being said, it's in your sideboard if you're not main decking it for whatever reason. In case your opponent has some good enters battlefield effects, don't forget it's there. It could help you out a little bit. I think this is more of a constructed card, though. It's just a stopgap for anything that could be abused in the future. So it's there. It's sideboard playable in case there's any decks that start to abuse enters battlefield effects a little too much. It keeps them in check. And who knows, could even see modern play out of sideboards at some point. Vampire Zeal is probably the best combat trick we've seen all day, actually. Target creature gets +2/+2 until end of turn, and if it's a vampire, it gets first strike. But even if it's not a vampire, the +2/+2 for 1 mana is good enough. This is a real fine combat trick if you're looking to run one. I'd like to run 1, maybe 2 combat tricks a lot of times, depending on the deck build, and this is a good one to go for. Awakening Sun's Avatar. Okay, now this is interesting. It's a mythic. It's kind of a take a little bit on Crux of Fate for dinosaurs. Now, a couple things I want to say about this card. Yes, it's playable and limited, but for me, it's not an early pick. I want to make sure I'm in a very specific deck before I pick this up. The deck I'm looking for is 2 things going for it. It has lots of dinosaurs, and it has some ramp as well as color fixing. If it doesn't meet those requirements, I'm not going to touch this. I'm just going to go pick something else up. I don't want to blow up my own stuff with this if I'm not all in on dinosaurs. And I don't want this sitting in my hand when I could have another big dinosaur play because I don't have the 3 white mana or because I can't get the ramp to get up to 8 mana at one time, right? So that to me makes this a little bit narrow for limited. Now, playable at times, yes, but a little bit narrow. Because of the casting cost, and again, because of the inconsistency here, I mean, it'd be horrible in a mirror matchup, right? I don't see this doing anything in standard. And then finally, Commander. Yeah, this is cool in Commander if I'm going for the Dinosaur Commander build, because you're going to run into so many different decks. I mean, sure, you might run into another Dinosaur deck, but even so, this is a huge creature. It's going to really hose a lot of people to the table, so it's a fine pickup for Commander and much easier to play in that format, obviously, with all the fixing and ramp that's available to you. So that's really what it feels like this card's designed for. And both mythics we saw today feel like they were really meant for Commander. And I'm okay with that. I feel like that's a good way to keep prices stable because Commander players only need 1 copy. If you make the mythics more desirable for Commander players, at least a percentage of the time, and put the more constructed cards at rare, uncommon, or common, then it helps keep the price of standard down. You're still getting some cool cards at Mythic that do big things that feel Mythic. It seems like it's a good design choice. Now, it's not consistent throughout all the Mythics, and we'll see that as we go through the set review throughout the week. There's some Mythics that are very standard playable, I think, and we'll talk about those. But I like that idea, at least just generally for design. With that being said, guess what? Those are the white cards for Ixalan. We're going to be back tomorrow. We're going to talk about all the blue cards in the set and keep moving forward and get you ready for that pre-release down the road. So until next time, hey, thanks for watching. Please remember to like and subscribe, and have a great day. Hey, thanks for watching. This video is made possible by the generous support of viewers like you on Patreon. Check out the description below for links to our Patreon page as well as our Amazon affiliate store, where a small percentage of all sales will also help support the channel. Finally, if you haven't had a chance yet to subscribe, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any new videos on Heroes and Legends. Talk to you again soon, and have a great day.